Well, Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to cover a variety of topics on value. And I want to start out with most recently, you and your team have published a piece of research in JAMA that demonstrated that more and more US-based cost-effectiveness analyses are citing the $100,000 to $150,000 per QALY threshold, up from that decades-long running threshold of $50,000 per QALY. About that is the benchmark by which to judge whether an intervention is cost-effective or not. What do you say are the concerns and controversies around this new threshold, and how and when do you believe it should be used in light of all of the controversies around QALYs?
Well, first, Patti, thanks very much for having me. There's long-standing debates about what the cost-effectiveness threshold should be. As you mentioned, for a long time, we've used $50,000 per QALY in the United States, even though it's never been quite clear where that came from and whether it's appropriate. There has been research done in recent years in the US that suggests that the threshold is probably between $100,000 and $150,000 under a series of what I think people might agree are reasonable assumptions. Now, that still leaves lots of questions and debates. Should it be higher for treatments for more severe diseases, for example? Should it be lower for treatments for mild diseases? Should it vary by other dimensions that we might think of, rare diseases versus more common diseases, and so forth? Those debates will always go on. What we did in the paper in JAMA is document what authors of US-based cost-effectiveness thresholds are citing as a way of trying to understand conventional wisdom among health economists on this topic. And as you say, more and more, the health economists are citing $100,000 to $150,000 per QALY. ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, uses a threshold of $100,000 to $150,000 per QALY. So to the extent we can understand any kind of consensus around this issue, we're probably in the range of $100,000 to $150,000 per QALY. Though again, debates continue, particularly over whether it should be higher for more severe diseases.
What do you think is the perfect use case of QALYs, given all of the controversies? What's the least controversial application?
Well, cost-effectiveness analyses that use QALYs are always going to be fraught with challenges. We use this information because we're trying to inform decisions about how we can best improve population health given resource constraints. But often when people hear cost-effectiveness or QALYs, they think about someone, a payer, denying care. They think about rationing of healthcare. So this will always be challenging. I think there are a number of very good use cases, and we should just emphasize in all of these cases, even the good use cases, the cost-effectiveness information using QALYs is an input into a decision-making process. Mm-hmm. It can be used in decisions around how we might price a new drug that brings real health benefits but is very expensive. And it helps us think about what might be an appropriate price. That certainly doesn't ignore controversies, but I think it's a good use case. We have seen less controversy when cost-effectiveness analysis is used for prevention or mm-hmm. to inform decisions around prevention rather than decisions around treatment. Mm-hmm. Probably because the prevention decisions, in the prevention decisions, it's less easy to identify someone who's already ill or already has a condition. Mm-hmm. So there's less of the identifiable patient. Mm-hmm. And we've also seen cost-effectiveness information being used around sort of broader resource allocation decisions. How should we spend money on a public health program,
Mhm.
or even how frequently we should screen for certain types of cancer. And again, these are never without debate, but perhaps more acceptable.
Let's pivot now to the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, that is rapidly approaching. In contrast to ex-US pharmaceutical markets, the US, of course, has historically had decentralized decision-making regarding drug value. What are some of the intended and unintended consequences that you can identify with the IRA, and what will you be watching for to see if the IRA is achieving its desired goals?
Well, in terms of intended consequences, it's clearly to reduce prices of drugs with a lot of Medicare spending that have been on the market for some time. In the case of small molecule drugs, 9 years. In the case of biologics, large molecule drugs, 13 years. So the intention is to reduce the prices of these products. The other intention is to lower the out-of-pocket spending for patients on Medicare, with particularly for lower income patients. So that will happen as this law is implemented. Now there are other intended consequences to exempt certain types of drugs from the Medicare negotiations. Orphan drugs, for example, with only a single indication. Drugs, for that matter, that have a generic equivalent are exempt because there's already a generic. There are, of course, some, let's call them unintended consequences, even though we might expect them. Pharmaceutical companies have new incentives in terms of their development programs. They now will have stronger incentives to develop biologics over small molecule drugs, because those biologics will have more time in the US market before they're subject to negotiations. There are incentives to bring orphan drugs to the market, as long as they only have a single indication. Once those orphan drugs have multiple indications, they will be subject to these negotiations. So, there's sort of lots of things to think through if you're a pharmaceutical company. Typically, what we've seen in the past is that the drug companies, for example, if they have products in oncology, they go after the small markets first, usually the fourth line therapy, the most severe part of the disease first, and then they expand into the earlier line therapies. And with the new law, though, because you want to maximize the time on the market for the larger indications, it'll change the sequencing of how the drug companies go after these indications, and even whether they'll go after some of the latter indications, if we call them that. So I'll be watching a number of things. Certainly watching how Medicare actually implements this law, because they are given a fair amount of discretion in terms of how they will negotiate the prices. Congress listed a whole series of factors that Medicare must consider. That's the key word, consider. Factors like the therapeutic advantage of the new drug, the comparative effectiveness of the new drug, the degree of unmet need, the research and development costs that were incurred in developing the drug, the degree to which the federal government supported the research and development of the drug. But it doesn't tell Medicare officials how to weight those different factors. So I, like many people, will be watching very carefully to see how Medicare actually weighs these different factors.
What do you anticipate will be the patient impact if pharmaceutical companies start front-loading the development focused with orphan drugs on the larger populations and diminishing their research in the others? Are they going to continue to do research in that, or just simply not seek any sort of regulatory approval for those additional indications? And what's going to happen in that arena?
Well, when we talk about the impacts of this law, we're talking about changing incentives and decisions that will be made, in a sense, on the margin, in the sense that there still is a lot of money in the system. The U.S. market is still a very large one, and there will still be strong incentives for drug companies to develop products for this market, including the Medicare population. But I think these changes in incentives are important and real, and probably mean we will have we won't see development of drugs that we might have seen under the old rules. Now, we don't know to what extent that will actually happen and which drugs will not be developed. It's hard to see, the dog that doesn't bark, as people sometimes say. But, for certain patient groups, they might have seen more active development in areas. They won't see that in the future. So, I think most of the estimates out there assume that we will forego some innovation because of this law. Now, there are always trade-offs with new legislation. The trade-off here is we'll forego some innovation, and in return, we're going to get lower drug prices. We're going to get some savings to the federal government, and we're going to lower the out-of-pocket spending for Medicare beneficiaries. How much we'll forego is the subject of a lot of debate. And the very different estimates out there. Some have argued it's going to be modest. Some have argued it's going to be really important and not modest. So, we will have to see how things pan out and do the best we can at trying to understand, what the impact rather is.
So, Peter, there are some important similarities and differences in how the IRA negotiation is going to take place versus traditional HTA negotiations when they're looking at the goal of determining a price, particularly as it relates to evidence considered and the methodologies used. What do you think the key differences will be, and how will these differences impact that?
I think the big one is traditional HTA is typically done at the product's launch. So at the product's launch, we have clinical trial information, the pivotal trials that were used to approve the drug, but we typically don't have a lot more. In the Medicare negotiations, those will take place many years after the product is launched. So we will have a lot more information about these products, particularly from real-world data. And I think that's going to be a key difference. We might have additional trials that have been done, and that's certainly possible and probable even. But I think the Medicare officials who will be negotiating these prices will have information from real-world evidence. That means information about how products compare to alternatives, even if those alternatives were not studied in randomized clinical trials. There will be information on how these products are being used. There will be information on adherence to these products by patients in the real world. There will be more information on the safety of these products, which typically comes from real-world evidence. So there'll be a lot more data available to the Medicare negotiators. Now, having said that, because the real-world data is not from randomized trials, there's a lot of challenges in really interpreting it, trying to adjust for confounders, and that's just the nature of it. So the upside is you have just a lot more information. The challenge is, we don't have randomization, so we need to really worry about selection and confounding and so forth. There are other differences, by the way. The law says that Medicare cannot use QALYs.
Right. So
some HTA bodies use QALYs, some don't, but Medicare will not be able to. So now Medicare can use, it seems, cost-effectiveness analysis as long as they don't use QALYs. Whether Medicare will choose to do that remains to be seen. I think they'll probably be very cautious about using any kind of cost-effectiveness information, even if it doesn't use QALYs.
what Would you advise pharmaceutical companies to be prepared for with respect to this increasing demand and opportunity for real world evidence? What should they be doing right now to prepare for this increased need?
Well, the pharmaceutical companies already do a lot of work in the real world data space. I think they'll need to double down on it and prepare for these negotiations, um, marshaling all of the real world evidence as well as all the trial evidence.
Mhm.
I think there will be a place for marshaling other kinds of data that we typically may not see as much of, patient-centered data, perhaps some surveys, and
Mm.
the degree to which patients might prefer a product because of its better dosing schedule or tolerability or things like that. Now, we don't know how and to what extent Medicare will actually look to such information, but I think it's in the company's interest to make those arguments based on the information to the extent that they have information like that. I think the companies will need to do a lot of work around potentially different comparators that Medicare might use in these analyses for the negotiations. Medicare has said they're going to start with the price of the alternative drug, but we don't know which alternative that will be. And often there are multiple alternatives for these products that will be subject to the negotiations. There might be a very cheap generic product from a competitor. There might be more expensive alternatives from active, as we might say, active comparators. But the companies really won't know what Medicare is doing until the negotiation begins, it seems. So they're going to have to really prepare for different kinds of possibilities. And they're being asked to do a lot in a short amount of time. So they really have to, I think, gear up and do a lot of background work in anticipation of the negotiation.
Are you seeing some of that activity already in the individuals that you work with?
Well, we don't know which drugs Medicare will select yet. They're going to select 10 drugs in September, and those will be 10 drugs from the high spend category of Part D to start with. So while we don't know the exact drugs, we have some pretty strong clues about good candidates and likely candidates here. So I know the companies that are sort of have targets on their backs, if you will, are doing a lot of work. They're running scenarios, they're collecting data, they're doing mock negotiation exercises and things like that.
Last year, you released a really excellent book, The Right Price, a value-based prescription for drug cost, that you and your co-authors, Joshua Cohen and Dan Ollendorf, wrote. It was a really insightful look into drug price valuation, analytic techniques, and ways to improve value assessments as it related to establishing the drug price. The first question I have is, what surprised you as you were pulling this book together?
Well, thank you for mentioning the book and your words. We thought there would be a place for a book about value-based drug pricing. That there's a lot of books out there, some critical of the industry, and there's pharmacoeconomic sort of technical books, but nothing that we could find that was a sort of policy-oriented book about how to do value-based drug pricing, why it's needed, what the challenges are, and so forth. So we set out to write that book. One thing that really surprised me is in writing about value-based pricing, I thought we would write a lot about cost-effectiveness analysis as the key tool that's used by many health economists and HTA bodies in the evaluation process. And we certainly write about that. But the more we began to write about the drug industry and the need for value-based pricing, the more we realized we needed to take a step back and write about insurance markets and the fact that most people have insurance for their drugs. So we need to think hard about the step of what goes into the benefit package, and not simply a patient who has a disease and what the value is of the drug to them, but the patient who has insurance but doesn't have the disease, but might have the disease one day, and the value of the drug to them. Because we're all, in a way, better off when these drugs get developed, even if we don't have that disease, but we might one day. So there's a kind of insurance aspect to it. That's one. And the other is we ended up thinking and writing more about innovation and how innovation happens, and the signals that prices send to the drug companies about what is of value to patients and to society. And if you want to write a book about value-based drug pricing, of course, you need to think hard about what it means to say a value-based drug price. What does value mean and to whom? And while we knew that coming in, there really is a very central aspect of the structure of the pharmaceutical industry and the nature of the incentives that we give and the signals that we send and the degree to which the government puts rules in place to have incentives. So, and while we knew all of that, I think we ended up just writing a lot more about innovation and insurance than perhaps we thought we would.
If you were to advise an insurance company based on your learnings from that book, what are one or two messages you might feed to them?
Well, I guess the two messages I would give is one, that there's a real benefit to value-based pricing, that we really would like to align the price with the value of the product, not the cost of developing the product or other things, not simply a lower price because we want lower prices. Of course, in some sense, everybody does, but that we would like to, in a way, mimic other markets where price reflects value. We don't want to pay above value because there are better uses of resources. We don't want to pay below value, though, because, again, we want to send the right signals to the innovators. But the other big issue is an affordability issue, that the value-based price might not address, solve, and often doesn't, the affordability issue. Now, the affordability issue is a matter of trying to lower out-of-pocket spending for patients when there are drugs that they really need. If there are really drugs that people need, there's not good reasons to confront them with high cost sharing. We have cost sharing because we want to prevent inappropriate use. And there may be a place for that in certain kinds of areas, but if we're looking at a patient with cancer or, I don't know, any serious illness, we would like to reduce incentives for patients to acquire products. But that means lowering co-payments and maybe even raising premiums. Now, it also means trying to displace items and services that are now being paid for that have lower value.
Right.
So there's all of this, I think, in the affordability question. And these are very hard issues. And, we come up with this book and these ideas around value-based pricing with, a dose of humility because we recognize the challenges. But we should aim in the right direction. Try to get value-based prices and try to lower copays and cost sharing drugs that people really need. And healthcare that people really need, not just drugs.
So am I hearing you suggest that there is a swath of high need, high value drugs that should be in the $0 copay or maybe incentivized to take the drug, much like they do in the vaccine arena?
Yes, absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit now about the broader value initiative, and I'm hoping you can summarize what that is for our listeners. But in a nutshell, from my end, it's designed to help facilitate increased value assessments for non-drug health services and procedures, and to lay out a research agenda for the future. What is this group bringing to the table that we have needed, and how are we going to know if it's contributing what it intends?
So we've seen over the years that a disproportionate share of value assessments, of cost effectiveness analyses, are targeting pharmaceutical therapies. Now, on the one hand, we need those analyses. So by all means, let's continue those. We need to know if these and how these drugs bring value to the marketplace. But we also need them in other areas of health and medicine. And that's the idea behind this initiative, that much of the spend in healthcare is on hospital services, on physician services. And depending on estimates, and these estimates do vary, drug spend as a percentage of total spend, probably in the 15 to 20% range. Mm-hmm. So most of the health spend, the 80%, is on non-drugs. Mm-hmm. But 40, 45%, depending on definitions and such, of the value assessments are on drugs. There may be some reasons for that. There's a different reimbursement pathway, and it's patents, budgets, intellectual properties, and certain budgets. But the initiative is really trying to understand how we can increase the value assessments in the non-drug space. Mm-hmm. And there are different ways we can do it. All of them have challenges. The government could fund more analyses in those areas. ICER can do more, and we argue should do more analyses of non-drug interventions. Private payers might even do more, though they typically don't tend to fund a lot of analyses here, but they might. There are other groups who might be doing more. So, I think to your question of how will we know if this is a success, we document how many cost-effectiveness analyses are done and what are the applications. So we'll be watching and just looking and seeing and quantifying. Are we seeing more analyses in the non-drug space? And there are analyses in the non-drug space even now. But, I think if we really want to get better value for our health spend in this country, we need to do more. So that's the purpose of that initiative.
A few years ago, you, Darius Lakdawala, and Gail Walensky advocated for a U.S. Institute of Health Technology assessment. What were you proposing that's not being addressed by ICER, who you just recently referenced? And what's insufficient about the work that ICER is doing that there was a need for this?
Well, we say, and I've written, ICER is certainly a fine organization doing good work for the health system in the U.S. They are focused on drugs. They have rather modest budget, and they do a few of these analyses a year, so 5 to 10, whatever it is. So part of what's missing is more funding for the non-drug space. I think there are also other activities that a new body, a new HTA organization, ideally a public one, could do. Work on methodological development, for example. The other point we make, and I've made this in other writing, ICER is a private organization. It's a private nonprofit organization. And while they do very good work, there's always a question of sort of accountability and legitimacy in the sense that they're not elected officials. Who are they speaking for? Who are they beholden to? And I think, in fairness, ICER does a very good job at trying to be the sort of public body in the U.S., thinking about the societal perspective, which they do to some extent, and thinking about this information as a public good. Nonetheless, what we argued is it would be better to have an independent public HTA body, which could exist and probably should exist alongside ICER. There's no reason for ICER, to go away. But this body would think about somewhat different areas of focus: services, procedures, diagnostics, devices, methods. Thinking about activities that are not being done by ICER.
Let's pivot now to something that's in the news and probably all over your computer as you do some of your research. I'm certainly using more of the artificial intelligence apps that are available. Machine learning and AI are everywhere in our daily narrative. I was listening to a podcast through the New York Times Daily, and it was with the godfather of AI. He was discussing the neural networks and the learning capacity of AI, that these tools that are out here could, used a phrase, that can consume the entire volume of the internet in a single month. And I was just blown away by that the capacity for ingesting information will never be, of course, matched by humans. If we were to think about the AI tools and how they might be used for better value assessment, let's say for more population cohorts, for example, by maybe scraping data to give us insights into these different population cohorts, what are some of the things that are in your mind when you're have a moment and when you think about how these AI and machine learning capabilities can be put to direct use in value assessment?
Well, first I should emphasize that I am not an AI expert, and so others sure have more knowledge about these things than I do. Having said that, my colleagues and I are closely watching this space and trying to understand how it can improve the kind of work that we do in value assessment. Some of it might be automating and making more efficient a lot of the processes we use, from literature reviews to data analytics. There's just the promise, I think, of much better and faster reviews of the literature and of databases, and faster analytics in terms of running analyses and understanding associations and modeling to the future, and on and on. So, I think we can just do a lot more and have a lot more information more quickly at hand. People talk about very rapidly searching electronic medical records in ways that will just vastly reduce the time it now takes to do chart reviews, and just finding information in the wealth of records that are out there. And that could well feed into the value assessments that we do, and again, more efficiently and in better ways. And people talk about tools to understand patterns and use that information to understand how drugs are working, or safety problems, or on and on and on. So, I mean, those are just some of the ways that we've begun to think about this. I'm sure there are others too, but I think the promise is this is a tool that will help our lives. And as you said, I think at the end of the day, we're still going to have to interpret this information. So, I see our work getting on the one hand easier, but still, at the end of the day, we will have to make judgments and interpretations of this information. So that won't go away.
Recently, your team at Tufts investigated whether drugs that were approved by the FDA through expedited review have offered larger health gains compared to those that were approved through conventional review processes. And indeed, you found that FDA prioritized the review of drugs offering the largest clinical advancements over existing care by including them in various expedited review programs. Has this worked to the benefit of American society? And what risk, if any, have we absorbed in exchange for access to more health gains?
We did this analysis that looked at the quality adjusted life years gained of expedited review versus drugs through conventional review, and found that the quality gains were higher. So, and there's a lot of uncertainty around those projections that we should emphasize, but that was the takeaway finding. Mm-hmm. So we've made decisions as a society through our laws that we're going to expedite certain types of products, those that are treating unmet needs, treating serious illness. We'll give them accelerated review or expedited review. So, for example, the FDA will approve them based on surrogate endpoints that are reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit.
Mm-hmm.
And then the companies have to do the confirmatory trials.
Mm-hmm.
Whether we've got it right, I think, is an open question, and whether it needs some revisiting is also a reasonable question. Some of the companies don't do the confirmatory trials in a timely manner, for example. It's hard to withdraw products once they're on the market, and so forth. On the other hand, there is a feeling, and strongly supported by patient groups and by many in Congress, that we want more innovation and we're willing to take some risks.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that the quality gains seem to be higher, I think, is a good signal that maybe we're doing this in a way that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
We have done other work that shows that the prices of those drugs tend to be higher too.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the cost effectiveness ratios tend to be higher, less favorable. Mm-hmm. So I think there's still, even if the quality gains or the health gains are higher, there's still additional questions that we need to look at carefully to see if we're getting this right. But, the research, I think, is an important piece of evidence that, maybe there's some reasons to think the FDA is doing some things right here too.
Mm-hmm. I often finish up interviews with this question, and I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are. You've been in academia much, if not the vast majority of your career, and the past decade has really stretched researchers and policymakers in incredible ways, right? And placed stresses on ethics, data, privacy, affordability, all of those things. Given that, if you were to advise medical schools and universities, what should they be adding into their curriculums or doing differently as they seek to train students to be better prepared for the environment they're going to be practicing in?
Yeah, well, the medical students have a lot already in their curriculum. So, it's one thing to advise that they should be doing more, and I'll give you an answer in a moment. But, we have to really think hard about all the things they're already doing. And does that mean displacing something that I'm sure is also important? Having said that, I think it would be very helpful for medical students to have some exposure to economics and decision science, to think hard about trade-offs in society that we make and we will always be forced to make, to think about incentives that decision makers have, to think about ethics, and that's another area that I think they already get some exposure to, but I think that's an area that would probably benefit from even more exposure. And those are the things I think come to mind. And, that resources are scarce, that choices are inevitable, and trade-offs are going to be made. And we need to be very thoughtful about them. And no matter how much incomes rise, that will always be the case. And we have great new science that's coming that promises new innovation, cures, and new therapies, and on and on. But it'll come with trade-offs, because the prices are going to be high and the resources are going to be scarce. And so having some exposure to those kinds of issues, I think, would be helpful.
And if you and I have the opportunity to have this chat in 5 years, what's going to be front and center?
Well, I'd certainly be interested in how Medicare has been doing on their price negotiations. So that's one. But I mean, the other thing I'm just going to be interested in 5 years is, what are some of the new breakthroughs that we have? new vaccines, new therapies for some of the diseases that we are facing, and and how are we paying for them, and what are the prices of them? I'll be watching all of those things and be very curious to see. And most importantly, has the population health improved in the 5 years, and in what areas? And has it been improving, equitably across populations? Those are really, at the end of the day, the critical questions.
Any parting words?
No, I thank you for your questions and your time, and it's been great chatting with you, and I was happy to do it.
Thank you, Peter. It's always a real pleasure.